In the twilight of the 13th century, as mighty empires crumbled and new powers fought for survival, a small and seemingly insignificant beylik emerged on the edge of Anatolia. Few could have imagined that this modest frontier state would one day command 3 continents, rule over millions of people, and reshape the course of history. This is the story of the Ottoman Empire, a saga of ambition, faith, conquest, and transformation that lasted for more than 6 centuries. From humble beginnings among warrior tribes to the grand triumph of capturing Constantinople, from the age of Suleiman the Magnificent to the slow unraveling that earned it the name, the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman journey is one of the most dramatic in the chronicles of civilization. Their legacy lingers in the cities they built, the laws they reformed, the trade routes they mastered, and the cultures they bridged between East and West. Tonight we will travel back through time, to the birth of a power that shaped modern borders, influenced global politics, and left behind stories of heroism, intrigue, and decline. Close your eyes, relax, and let history unfold as we begin the tale of the Ottomans. Before we set sail on this journey through centuries of empire and intrigue, make sure to subscribe and join our growing community of history lovers. Every week, we bring you powerful stories from the past, narrated to help you learn, reflect, and drift peacefully into knowledge-filled rest. At the turn of the 14th century, Anatolia was a land of fractured powers, a region caught between fading empires and rising ambitions. The Byzantine Empire was weakened, its once mighty borders reduced to a shadow of their former expanse, while the Mongol influence lingered in the east, leaving a patchwork of small Turkic beyliks scattered across the land. Among these small frontier principalities, one stood out not because of its immediate strength but because of its strategic position and leadership, the beylik of the Ottomans. Founded around 1299 by Osman I, this beylik began as a modest domain on the Byzantine frontier, with no more than a handful of warriors and a dream of expansion. Osman I inherited a landscape of opportunity. The Byzantine lands to the west were weak and fragmented, plagued by internal disputes and lacking the resources to defend their borders effectively. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, which once dominated Anatolia, had been broken by the Mongols, leaving a power vacuum that ambitious warlords were eager to fill. Osman, the son of Ertugrul, recognized that survival in this frontier zone required both courage and cunning. He forged alliances, encouraged migration of Turkic tribes into his territory, and used the frontier warrior ethos, the Ghazi spirit, to attract followers who saw their campaigns as both religious duty and opportunity. Under Osman's leadership, the early Ottoman state grew not by grand conquests but by a series of calculated raids and steady territorial acquisitions. Villages and small forts on the Byzantine border fell one by one, often with minimal resistance. Osman's ability to integrate conquered peoples and offer relative stability in an era of chaos set the foundation for his beylik's future. He emphasized justice and fair governance, which won over many local populations disillusioned by Byzantine neglect. When Osman died around 1326, his son Orhan took the reins and transformed the beylik into a more organized polity. Orhan's reign marked a turning point. He captured Bursa in 1326, making it the first major Ottoman capital. This was more than just a military victory, it gave the Ottomans a stable economic base, a thriving city, and a symbol of permanence. Orhan also introduced administrative reforms, minted coins in his name, and established a more structured military. The Ottomans were no longer just raiders on horseback, they were becoming a state. One of the most significant innovations of this period was the development of the Janissary Corps, an elite infantry force composed initially of young Christian boys recruited through the Devshirme system. These boys were converted to Islam, trained rigorously, and became loyal soldiers of the Sultan. The creation of this force gave the Ottomans a military edge over their rivals, as it combined discipline with a strong central command. The mid-14th century was a period of opportunity for the Ottomans as the Byzantine Empire continued its decline. Civil wars and external threats left Constantinople increasingly isolated, and the Balkan states were fragmented and often at odds with one another. The Ottomans began to cross into Europe, establishing a foothold at Gallipoli in 1354 after a devastating earthquake weakened the Byzantine defenses. This crossing into the Balkans would change the course of Ottoman history, turning them from a regional Anatolian power into a transcontinental empire. Murad I, who ruled from 1362 to 1389, expanded these European holdings further, capturing Adrianople, Edirne, and making it the new Ottoman capital. He established systems to manage the newly conquered lands, creating a structure of timars, land grants given to cavalrymen in exchange for military service. This feudal-like arrangement allowed the Ottomans to maintain control over vast territories with relatively limited administrative resources. The Battle of Kosovo in 1389 marked both triumph and tragedy for the Ottomans. Though Murad I was assassinated during the battle, his forces emerged victorious against the coalition of Balkan rulers. This secured Ottoman influence in the region and paved the way for further expansion. Murad's successor, Bayezid I, known as Yildirim or the Thunderbolt, continued the campaigns with remarkable speed. He expanded Ottoman territory deep into the Balkans and Anatolia, even laying siege to Constantinople in 1394. However, Bayezid's ambitions met a formidable challenge in the east, the armies of Timur, the Turco-Mongol conqueror. The Battle of Ankara in 1402 was a catastrophic defeat for the Ottomans. Bayezid was captured, and the empire descended into a period of civil war known as the Ottoman Interregnum. For over a decade, rival sons of Bayezid fought for control, and the empire seemed on the brink of collapse. It was Mehmed I who eventually restored unity around 1413, rebuilding the shattered state and reasserting control over its core territories. His reign marked a phase of recovery, where the Ottomans consolidated rather than expanded. He focused on restoring administrative order, rebuilding the economy and re-establishing alliances. Murad II, succeeding Mehmed I in 1421, renewed the drive into the Balkans and fought against both Christian coalitions and internal rebellions. His reign saw the continuation of pressure on Constantinople, but it was his son who would fulfill the long-standing Ottoman dream of conquering the city. That son was Mehmed II, later known as Mehmed the Conqueror. Ascending the throne in 1451, Mehmed was determined, visionary, and unrelenting. He recognized that to truly transform the Ottomans from a powerful state into a lasting empire, Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine world, had to fall. The city was not only strategically vital but also symbolically rich, representing the continuation of the Roman legacy. In 1453, after meticulous preparation, Mehmed launched his assault on Constantinople. He assembled a massive army, constructed a formidable navy and employed cutting-edge siege technology, including massive cannons that battered the ancient walls. For 53 days, the city held out under Emperor Constantine XI, but on May 29, 1453, the Ottomans breached the defenses. The fall of Constantinople marked the end of the Byzantine Empire and the dawn of a new era. Mehmed II transformed the city into Istanbul, making it the capital of the Ottoman Empire. He invited traders, scholars, and artisans, revitalizing the city as a hub of commerce and culture. Under his rule, the Ottomans not only expanded their territories but also began to see themselves as heirs to both the Islamic Caliphate and the Roman imperial tradition. By the mid-15th century, the Ottomans had secured their place as a rising imperial power. Their dominion stretched across Anatolia and the Balkans, their capital was one of the greatest cities in the world, and their administration combined flexibility with centralized authority. The groundwork had been laid for an empire that would dominate for centuries, bridging continents, faiths, and cultures. This transformation from a small frontier beylik to a powerful empire was not merely the result of military strength. It was driven by a combination of strategic marriages, pragmatic governance, religious legitimacy, and adaptability in the face of challenges. The Ottomans learned from their setbacks, absorbed diverse peoples, and used both sword and diplomacy to shape their destiny. The story of the Ottoman rise between 1299 and 1453 is a testament to how vision, opportunity, and resilience can turn obscurity into dominance. It was the beginning of a journey that would see the Ottomans become a central force in the political, cultural, and economic life of three continents. The mid-15th century had established the Ottoman Empire as a formidable power, but it was in the 16th century that the empire reached the zenith of its classical era. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 transformed the Ottomans from a rising frontier state into a major imperial power, and the decades that followed were marked by consolidation, expansion, and the refinement of their administrative and cultural identity. The reign of Mehmed II laid the foundations, but it would be his successors who expanded upon this vision and transformed the empire into one of the greatest in the world. After Mehmed the Conqueror's death in 1481, his son Bayezid II inherited a vast and diverse realm. Bayezid's reign was one of relative stability and cautious expansion. Unlike his father, who had been a relentless warrior, Bayezid focused on strengthening internal administration, supporting arts and architecture, and managing the challenges posed by rising European naval power in the Mediterranean. He avoided major wars when possible and maintained a careful balance between the empire's Christian and Muslim populations. During his rule, the empire became a safe haven for refugees, notably welcoming Jews expelled from Spain in 1492, who brought with them skills, trade networks, and cultural richness that enriched Ottoman cities like Salonika and Istanbul. The transition from Bayezid II to his son Selim I, known as Selim the Grim, marked a shift in the empire's trajectory. Selim, who seized the throne after a brief but intense succession struggle, was a warrior sultan who vastly expanded Ottoman influence. His campaigns in the early 16th century were aimed primarily at the east and south. Between 1514 and 1517, Selim defeated the Safavid Persians at Calderon, securing eastern Anatolia, and turned his armies toward the crumbling Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. With remarkable speed, he conquered Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. These conquests transformed the Ottomans from a primarily Anatolian Balkan power into the preeminent Islamic empire, inheriting the caliphate and control of the Islamic heartlands. Selim's reign was relatively short, but his achievements were monumental. He centralized power further, expanded the empire's territories dramatically, and laid the groundwork for his son's legendary reign. When Selim died in 1520, the throne passed to Suleiman I, known to the West as Suleiman the Magnificent and to his own subjects as Suleiman the Lawgiver. Suleiman's reign, 1520 to 1566, is often considered the golden age of the Ottoman Empire. He inherited a strong, wealthy state with established institutions and vast territories, and he pushed its boundaries to their greatest extent. In the West, his armies marched deep into Europe, capturing Belgrade in 1521 and laying siege to Vienna in 1529. Although the siege failed, it signaled the Ottomans' dominant position in Central Europe and their ability to challenge the Habsburgs, one of the most powerful dynasties of the time. In the Mediterranean, Suleiman's navy, under the command of legendary admirals like Barbarossa Hayreddin Pasha, established Ottoman supremacy across the sea. The empire controlled key ports and islands, turning the eastern Mediterranean into an Ottoman lake. The capture of Rhodes in 1522 and the alliance with France against the Habsburgs demonstrated the Ottomans' ability to combine military might with diplomatic strategy. To the east, Suleiman's forces continued the struggle with the Safavids, consolidating Ottoman control over Mesopotamia and securing the empire's eastern frontiers. In North Africa, the empire extended its influence over Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya, incorporating them as semi-autonomous provinces under Ottoman suzerainty. By the mid-16th century, the Ottoman Empire stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia and from the North African coast to the Persian Gulf. Yet Suleiman's greatness was not only measured in territorial expansion. He was a lawgiver and reformer, overseeing the codification of laws that balanced Islamic principles with practical governance. These laws, known as the Canon, regulated taxation, land tenure, trade, and social relations, creating a more consistent and predictable system across the empire's diverse lands. Suleiman also invested heavily in architecture and culture, commissioning grand projects like the Suleiman Mosque in Istanbul, designed by the great architect Mimar Sinan, whose works came to symbolize the empire's grandeur. Under Suleiman, the Ottoman court became a center of art, poetry, and learning. Istanbul flourished as a cosmopolitan metropolis, attracting scholars, merchants, and artisans from across Europe, Asia, and Africa. The empire became a crucial node in global trade networks, connecting the spice routes of the Indian Ocean with the markets of Europe. Suleiman's later years were marked by both triumph and personal tragedy. His long reign brought stability, but it also sowed the seeds of future succession struggles. The infamous intrigue of the harem, including the influence of his wife Hurrem Sultan, Roxolana, and the execution of his capable son Mustafa, weakened the line of succession. When Suleiman died in 1566 during the siege of Sijitvar, the empire was still at its height, but the cracks in its political fabric were beginning to show. Suleiman was succeeded by his son Selim II, known as Selim the Sot, whose reign signaled a subtle but important shift. While the empire remained vast and powerful, the Sultan began to withdraw from direct governance, delegating authority to grand viziers and palace officials. This marked the start of a gradual decline in sultanic authority that would become more pronounced in the following centuries. Despite these changes, the classical Ottoman system established during and after Suleiman's reign endured. The Timar system continued to provide military manpower, the Devshirme system supplied capable administrators and Janissaries, and the empire's diverse subjects, Muslims, Christians and Jews, were managed through the millet system, which granted religious communities a degree of autonomy in exchange for loyalty and taxes. The empire also became a key player in the age of global exploration and commerce. While European powers like Spain and Portugal began their voyages around Africa and into the Americas, the Ottomans remained a dominant force controlling the eastern Mediterranean, Red Sea, and Persian Gulf. They were less aggressive in pursuing overseas colonies, but their strategic location allowed them to profit immensely from trade. By the late 16th century, the Ottoman Empire was a vast, complex, and still largely successful polity. It faced challenges, growing European naval power, shifting trade routes, and internal corruption, but its classical institutions and the legacy of its great rulers provided resilience. The empire was no longer the hungry frontier state of Osman and Orhan, nor merely the conquering machine of Selim and Suleiman. It was now an empire of cities, laws and cultures, stretching across 3 continents and embodying the height of early modern Islamic power. The classical era of the Ottoman Empire thus represents both the peak of its strength and the beginning of subtle transformations. The seeds of its future struggles, succession crises, military stagnation and economic pressures, were sown in this period, but they were hidden beneath the splendor of its golden age. For the time being, the Ottomans stood as one of the great powers of the world, their crescents visible on distant horizons and their influence felt from the Balkans to the Indian Ocean. The Ottoman Empire ruled over a vast and diverse population for centuries, stretching across 3 continents and encompassing many religions, languages, and ethnic groups. The success of its administration was rooted in its ability to manage this diversity through a combination of flexible governance, religious tolerance within limits, and a strong military administrative system. At the heart of this system was the millet organization, a unique structure that allowed non-Muslim communities to govern their own religious and civil affairs. Alongside this stood the Janissaries, an elite corps that not only served as a formidable military force but also played a significant role in the administration. Taxation policies, trade networks, and the central role of Islam further defined how the Ottomans managed their empire. The millet system was one of the most distinctive features of Ottoman administration. In an empire that included Christians, Jews, and Muslims, the Ottomans realized early that enforcing strict uniformity would lead to resistance and instability. Instead, they developed a system where religious communities were recognized as semi-autonomous entities or millets. Each millet had its own religious leader, who acted as both a spiritual guide and a political representative to the Ottoman authorities. For Christians, this might be a patriarch, for Jews, a chief rabbi, and for Muslims, the structure already aligned with Islamic governance. These leaders oversaw internal matters such as marriage, divorce, inheritance, education, and religious practice. In return for this autonomy, the millets pledged loyalty to the Sultan and ensured the collection of taxes within their communities. This system fostered a sense of belonging and reduced the likelihood of rebellion, as people felt their faith and traditions were respected within the overarching rule of the empire. The Janissaries were another cornerstone of Ottoman administration. Originally formed in the 14th century as an elite infantry corps, they were drawn largely from Christian boys taken through the Devshirme system. This system, often called the blood tax, involved the periodic collection of boys from Christian families in the Balkans and other regions. These boys were converted to Islam, trained in military and administrative skills, and brought up in the service of the Sultan. Far from being a mere military force, the Janissaries became deeply integrated into the state machinery. They served as guards of the palace, administrators in the provinces, and even acted as a check on local governors. Their loyalty was to the Sultan alone, and this created a central power base that bypassed traditional aristocracies and local feudal structures. Over time, however, the Janissaries gained significant political influence, which in later centuries contributed to internal instability and resistance to reform. Taxation was a fundamental element of Ottoman rule, ensuring the flow of revenue that sustained the army, bureaucracy, and infrastructure of the empire. The system was multifaceted, with taxes levied on land, agriculture, trade, and individuals. The timar system was a key component. Lands were granted to sipahis or cavalry soldiers in return for military service. These timar holders collected taxes from the peasants working the land but did not own the land outright. It belonged to the state. This ensured a steady supply of armed men without creating an independent landed aristocracy that could challenge the sultan. Non-Muslims paid an additional tax known as the jizya, a poll tax that was part of the Islamic legal tradition for protected peoples or dhimmis. This tax exempted them from military service and allowed them to practice their religion under Ottoman protection. Trade taxes were also significant, especially as the empire controlled key routes between Europe, Asia, and Africa. Customs duties on caravans, ports, and markets generated substantial income, and the Ottomans maintained elaborate systems of way stations and tax farms to ensure revenue collection. Trade networks under the Ottomans were both vast and strategically significant. The empire sat at the crossroads of major trade routes, connecting the Mediterranean with the Black Sea, the Indian Ocean, and the Silk Road. Cities such as Istanbul, Aleppo, Cairo, and Baghdad flourished as commercial hubs, drawing merchants from Venice, Genoa, Persia, and India. The Ottomans invested in infrastructure to support this trade. Caravanserais provided safe lodging for merchants, roads and bridges facilitated transport, and ports like Smyrna and Salonika became gateways for goods flowing between continents. The state regulated trade to ensure stability, often fixing prices for essential goods and controlling grain supplies to prevent famine. Guilds played an important role in urban centers, setting standards for craftsmanship, wages, and apprenticeships. Through this network, the empire became not only a political power but also a major economic player in the pre-modern world. Islam formed the ideological backbone of Ottoman governance. The Sultan was both a political ruler and, after 1517 when the caliphate was transferred to the Ottomans, a spiritual leader for the Sunni Muslim world. Islamic law, or Sharia, was integrated into the legal system, particularly in matters of family law, property, and criminal justice. However, the Ottomans also maintained a parallel system of secular law, known as canon, issued by the Sultan to address matters not explicitly covered by Sharia. This dual legal system allowed flexibility and adaptation to changing circumstances while maintaining the legitimacy of Islamic governance. Religious endowments, or waqfs, played a major role in funding schools, hospitals, mosques, and public works, creating a social safety net that reinforced the Sultan's image as a just ruler. The relationship between Muslims and non-Muslims in the empire was complex and pragmatic. While Islam was privileged and conversion to Islam often brought social and financial benefits, the Ottomans avoided large-scale forced conversions. Instead, they relied on the jizya and the loyalty of the millets to maintain order. In many regions, Christians and Jews thrived under Ottoman rule, particularly in trade, medicine, and diplomacy. The empire became a refuge for Jews expelled from Spain in 1492, welcoming them into cities like Salonika and Istanbul, where they became vital contributors to commerce and culture. Armenians played key roles as merchants and artisans. Greeks dominated shipping in the Aegean, and Arab merchants connected the empire to Indian Ocean trade. This diversity was both a strength and, at times, a source of tension, as nationalist movements in the 19th century began to challenge the delicate balance. Corruption and inefficiency sometimes plagued the taxation and administrative systems. Tax farming, where individuals bid for the right to collect taxes in a region, often led to exploitation of peasants and reduced central control. The Janissaries, once a disciplined elite, became hereditary and resistant to change, undermining military effectiveness. The millet system, while initially a tool of stability, eventually reinforced communal divisions and hindered the development of a unified Ottoman identity. These weaknesses would become more apparent in later centuries, as European powers advanced militarily and economically. Despite these flaws, for much of its history, the Ottoman system worked remarkably well. It allowed a multi-ethnic empire to function with relatively little internal strife compared to its size and diversity. Roads were maintained, trade flourished, cities thrived, and cultural life was rich. The combination of Islamic legitimacy, pragmatic governance, and military strength created a state that endured for over 6 centuries. The balance between central authority and local autonomy, between Sharia and canon, between Muslim dominance and non-Muslim participation, was a hallmark of Ottoman statecraft. The role of Islam in daily life was reinforced through education and law. Madrasas or Islamic schools educated future bureaucrats, judges and scholars, ensuring a steady supply of loyal administrators. The ulama, a body of Islamic scholars, worked closely with the state to issue legal opinions or fatwas that supported imperial policies. Friday sermons in mosques proclaimed the sultan's name, symbolizing his authority over the faithful. At the same time, Sufi orders spread throughout the empire, providing spiritual guidance and social cohesion in rural and urban areas alike. Many Ottoman rulers patronized Sufi lodges, seeing them as stabilizing forces in distant provinces. Trade policies were designed not only to enrich the state but also to protect local producers. The Ottomans often restricted foreign merchants from dominating internal markets, though they granted special privileges, known as capitulations, to European traders when it suited their interests. These capitulations, initially tools of diplomacy, later became a source of economic dependence as European powers exploited them to gain trade advantages. Nevertheless, during the height of the empire, the flow of goods like silk, spices, coffee, and grain made Ottoman ports some of the busiest in the world. The Ottoman approach to governance was neither entirely centralized nor fully decentralized. Provincial governors, known as beys or pashas, wielded considerable power in their regions but were appointed by and accountable to the sultan. In strategically important provinces, the presence of Janissary garrisons and the direct oversight of imperial inspectors ensured loyalty. In more remote or tribal areas, the Ottomans often relied on local leaders, allowing them to maintain traditional authority in exchange for taxes and military support. This flexibility helped integrate diverse territories ranging from the deserts of Arabia to the mountains of the Balkans. Over the centuries, as the empire expanded and contracted, these systems evolved. The millet system became more rigid, the Janissaries more corrupt, and trade routes shifted with the rise of European maritime powers. Yet, the foundational principles established in the classical period of the empire, religious accommodation, efficient taxation, strong military presence, and the guiding framework of Islam, remained at the core of Ottoman rule. These principles explain how a small Anatolian principality grew into a world empire and maintained its authority over a mosaic of peoples for centuries. The Ottoman Empire's rise as a maritime power was a critical component of its expansion and its ability to dominate vast territories across 3 continents. While the early Ottomans were primarily a land-based power, their geographical position along the coasts of the Aegean, the Mediterranean, and the Black Sea pushed them to develop a strong naval presence. From the 14th century onward, the Ottomans gradually built a fleet capable of challenging long-established maritime powers such as Venice, Genoa, and later Spain and Portugal. Their navy played a decisive role not only in warfare but also in controlling trade routes, projecting power across distant regions, and defending their shores against European incursions. Among the most famous naval engagements of this era was the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, a dramatic clash that symbolized both the height and the beginning of challenges for Ottoman naval supremacy. In the early years of Ottoman expansion, the navy was modest and largely confined to the Aegean Sea. The conquest of Gallipoli in 1354 gave the Ottomans their first major foothold in Europe and opened a strategic gateway between Asia and the Balkans. From this base, they began to develop shipbuilding capabilities and recruit sailors, often drawing upon experienced Greek, Albanian, and other local seafaring populations. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 under Mehmed II transformed the naval strategy of the empire. With the city now as the capital, renamed Istanbul, the Ottomans controlled the Bosporus and the Sea of Marmara, key points for maritime trade between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Mehmed understood the importance of naval power. His conquest of Constantinople relied heavily on the transport of troops and the blockade of the Byzantine capital from the sea. After this triumph, the Ottoman navy began to expand more aggressively. The 16th century marked the golden era of the Ottoman navy. Under Sultan Selim I and, more prominently, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the empire developed one of the most formidable fleets in the Mediterranean. The Ottomans captured key ports in the Levant, Egypt, and North Africa, transforming cities like Alexandria, Algiers, and Tripoli into major naval bases. This expansion brought the empire into direct conflict with the maritime republics of Venice and Genoa, who had long dominated Mediterranean trade. To consolidate their naval strength, the Ottomans invested in shipyards at Gallipoli, Istanbul, and later at Suez for Red Sea operations. These shipyards produced large galleys, the principal warships of the period, which relied on oarsmen and were armed with cannons. The state employed skilled craftsmen, often from conquered regions, to improve ship design and artillery. One of the defining features of Ottoman naval power was its reliance on corsairs and privateers in the western Mediterranean. Figures such as Hayreddin Barbarossa, a legendary admiral of the Ottoman fleet, played a crucial role in extending Ottoman influence across the Maghreb. Barbarossa and his successors operated from bases in Algiers and Tunis, harassing European shipping and protecting Muslim and Ottoman trade routes. These corsairs were both a source of wealth, through plunder and ransoms, and a strategic asset, as they tied down Spanish and Italian forces along the North African coast. The integration of the North African regencies into the Ottoman sphere provided the empire with valuable manpower, ships, and harbors from which to challenge Spain and the Holy League. The Mediterranean during this era was a theater of constant competition. The Spanish Empire, having unified its territories under Ferdinand and Isabella and later Charles V, sought to dominate the western Mediterranean and protect its routes to the Americas. Venice, though declining, remained a powerful commercial force in the eastern Mediterranean, controlling Crete, Cyprus and key islands. The Ottomans, for their part, aimed to secure Muslim trade, protect their coastal provinces and extend their influence into Europe by controlling sea access. Naval battles were frequent, with shifting alliances and truces punctuating long periods of warfare. The Ottomans achieved significant victories, such as the conquest of Rhodes in 1522 from the Knights Hospitaller, which gave them a critical base in the eastern Mediterranean, and the capture of Cyprus in 1570, which removed a major Venetian stronghold. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571 stands out as the most famous naval encounter of this period. A coalition of European powers, known as the Holy League and organized by Pope Pius V, brought together Spain, Venice, the Papal States and several Italian principalities to confront the Ottoman fleet. The battle took place in the Gulf of Patras, off the coast of western Greece. Commanded by Ali Pasha, the Ottoman fleet met the forces of Don John of Austria in one of the largest galley battles in history. The Ottomans suffered a devastating defeat, losing over 200 ships and thousands of men. The victory was celebrated in Europe as a turning point against the perceived unstoppable advance of Ottoman power. However, the strategic impact was less decisive than often portrayed. Within a year, the Ottomans rebuilt their fleet, and the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean remained largely unchanged. The empire retained Cyprus and continued to exert influence over its maritime territories. Despite this resilience, the defeat at Lepanto symbolized the beginning of a gradual shift in Mediterranean naval supremacy. European powers, particularly Spain and later the Dutch and the English, increasingly turned to more advanced sailing ships, which could carry heavier artillery and operate in open seas beyond the Mediterranean. The Ottoman navy, heavily reliant on traditional galleys and oar-powered vessels, was slower to adopt these innovations. Furthermore, the discovery of new sea routes around Africa to India and the Americas shifted global trade away from the Mediterranean, reducing its centrality and the strategic advantage it once offered the Ottomans. The Ottomans did not confine their naval ambitions to the Mediterranean alone. Under Suleiman I and his successors, they extended their naval reach into the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean to counter Portuguese expansion. The establishment of the Ottoman fleet at Suez allowed them to project power toward Yemen, the Persian Gulf, and even as far as the coasts of India. Alliances with local rulers such as the Sultan of Aceh in Southeast Asia reflected the global dimension of Ottoman maritime interests. However, their success in these waters was limited compared to their dominance in the Mediterranean, largely due to logistical challenges and the superior oceanic fleets of the Portuguese and later the Dutch. Control over the Black Sea was another strategic priority for the Ottomans. With the conquest of Constantinople, the empire gained dominance over the Bosporus and later extended its power to the Crimean Khanate, a vassal state that acted as a buffer and ally. The Black Sea became an almost exclusive Ottoman lake, with trade and shipping largely restricted to Ottoman and allied merchants. This control ensured grain supplies from the Danube region and Crimea, feeding the growing population of Istanbul and other cities. The organization of the Ottoman Navy was closely tied to the central administration. The Capitan Pasha, or Grand Admiral, was a high-ranking official often involved in both military and political affairs. The navy operated from major arsenals, the most famous being the Imperial Arsenal in Istanbul, which employed thousands of workers, shipbuilders and craftsmen. Sailors were recruited from coastal regions of Anatolia, the Aegean Islands and North Africa, while galleys often relied on slaves or prisoners of war as oarsmen, a practice common to all Mediterranean navies of the time. Trade and naval power were deeply intertwined. Control of maritime routes allowed the Ottomans to facilitate and protect the flow of goods such as grain, spices, coffee and textiles. Ports were bustling centers of commerce where merchants from across Europe, the Middle East and Asia exchanged goods. The state imposed taxes and customs duties, which became a major source of revenue. Naval patrols combated piracy when it threatened Ottoman interests, though at times, as with the corsairs, piracy was sanctioned when it served strategic aims. The decline of the Ottoman navy became more apparent in the 17th and 18th centuries. The shift of global trade routes to the Atlantic and Indian Oceans reduced the strategic value of Mediterranean dominance. European powers invested heavily in new ship technologies, including heavily armed sailing ships and later ships of the line, while the Ottomans remained reliant on traditional galley fleets far longer than their rivals. Reforms were attempted, including the introduction of European shipbuilding techniques and the recruitment of foreign advisors, but internal resistance, corruption and lack of resources often undermined these efforts. Nevertheless, the legacy of Ottoman naval power is undeniable. For centuries, their fleets maintained the security of vital trade routes, facilitated the expansion of the empire, and projected power far beyond the Anatolian heartland. Naval victories enabled the conquest of key territories, while even their defeats did not immediately dismantle their maritime presence. The image of Ottoman galleys, adorned with the crescent and the banner of the Sultan, became a symbol of both fear and respect throughout the Mediterranean world. In the broader picture of world history, the Ottoman navy exemplified the transition between medieval and early modern maritime warfare. It operated in an era where oar-powered galleys coexisted with emerging sailing technologies, where piracy and commerce were often two sides of the same coin, and where control of coastal fortresses could determine the fate of empires. The Ottomans mastered this environment during their peak, but their slower adaptation to the age of oceanic empires eventually left them at a disadvantage. By the dawn of the 19th century, the Ottoman navy was a shadow of its former self, its fleets often outmatched by the navies of Britain, France, and Russia. Yet, the memory of its golden age, when corsairs raided the coasts of Spain, when the Sultan's banners flew over Cyprus and Rhodes, and when the Mediterranean was for a time an Ottoman sea, remained a defining chapter in the empire's history. The rise of this powerful navy had enabled the Ottomans to expand their empire, protect their commerce and challenge some of the greatest naval powers of Europe, leaving a maritime legacy that shaped the region for centuries. The Ottoman Empire, at the height of its power, faced two major and enduring challenges on its frontiers: the Habsburg monarchy in the west and the Safavid Empire in the east. These rivalries defined much of its military, political, and diplomatic strategies for centuries. The confrontation with the Habsburgs revolved around the control of Central Europe, especially Hungary, while the struggle with the Safavids was both territorial and religious, fueled by the Sunni-Shia divide. These twin pressures forced the Ottomans to fight on multiple fronts, shape their alliances carefully, and adapt their military systems to the changing landscape of early modern warfare. The Habsburg monarchy, led by the Austrian branch of the dynasty, was the foremost Christian power opposing the Ottomans in Europe. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the Ottomans steadily advanced into the Balkans, bringing them into direct conflict with the Habsburgs, who controlled much of Central Europe and acted as defenders of the Holy Roman Empire. Hungary became the principal battleground between the two empires. The Battle of Mohacs in 1526 was a watershed moment. The Ottoman army under Suleiman the Magnificent decisively defeated the Hungarian forces, leading to the death of King Louis II and the collapse of the medieval Kingdom of Hungary. This victory opened the gates for Ottoman expansion deep into Central Europe. Buda was captured, and a large portion of Hungary came under direct Ottoman rule, while the rest was divided between Habsburg-controlled Royal Hungary and the Principality of Transylvania, which often acted as an Ottoman vassal. The Ottoman-Habsburg rivalry was not only a matter of territory but also of prestige and ideology. The Ottomans presented themselves as the champions of Islam and the rightful rulers of lands they had conquered, while the Habsburgs, aligned with the papacy and other Christian powers, framed the conflict as a defense of Christendom against Muslim advance. This dynamic created a series of wars and sieges that lasted for generations. The Siege of Vienna in 1529, led by Suleiman, was a dramatic episode in which the Ottomans attempted to capture the Habsburg capital. Harsh weather, logistical difficulties, and stiff resistance forced them to withdraw, marking the first major setback in their westward expansion. A second attempt in 1683, more than 150 years later, also failed, but this time with far greater consequences. Between these two sieges, the Ottoman-Habsburg frontier was a zone of constant warfare, raids, and shifting alliances. Fortresses were built and rebuilt along the Danube and in the plains of Hungary. Both sides employed not only large armies but also irregular forces such as the Ottoman Akinci raiders and the Habsburg border guards known as Grenzers. The 30 Years' War in Europe offered the Ottomans opportunities to exploit Habsburg weakness, and at times they allied with France, a Catholic power but rival to the Habsburgs, in a classic example of pragmatic diplomacy over religious solidarity. Peace treaties were occasionally signed, such as the Treaty of Zitvatorok in 1606, which marked a shift in Ottoman policy by recognizing the Habsburg emperor as an equal rather than a tributary, but these agreements were often temporary pauses in a long struggle. While the Habsburg front consumed much Ottoman attention, the eastern frontier with the Safavid Empire was equally, if not more, challenging in its own way. The Safavid dynasty, which rose to power in Persia at the start of the 16th century under Shah Ismail I, established Shia Islam as the state religion, creating a profound ideological divide with the Sunni Ottoman state. This religious schism added a sectarian dimension to what was also a contest for control over strategic regions such as eastern Anatolia, Azerbaijan, and Iraq. The first major conflict between the two powers was the Battle of Calderon in 1514, during the reign of Sultan Selim I. The Ottomans, employing superior artillery and firearms, decisively defeated the Safavids, limiting their westward expansion and securing much of eastern Anatolia for the empire. Despite this early Ottoman victory, the border between the two empires remained fluid for centuries. Cities like Tabriz, Baghdad, and Erzurum changed hands multiple times as treaties were signed and broken. The Safavids often sought to incite revolts among the Shia population within Ottoman territories, while the Ottomans supported Sunni factions in Persia when it suited their interests. The rivalry also had a strong economic component. Both empires desired control over the lucrative trade routes that passed through the Caucasus and Mesopotamia, connecting the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean to the Silk Road. One of the most significant phases of the Ottoman-Safavid conflict occurred under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, who launched several campaigns into Persia and Iraq. In 1534, Suleiman captured Baghdad, bringing the holy cities of Najaf and Karbala under Ottoman control and strengthening their claim to leadership over the Muslim world. The Treaty of Hagia in 1555 established a relatively stable frontier, dividing the contested territories and allowing a brief period of peace. However, this peace was fragile, and wars resumed in the following decades, especially as the Safavids under Shah Abbas I reasserted their power and sought to modernize their army with European assistance. The dual frontiers strained the Ottoman military and finances. Fighting prolonged wars in the west against the Habsburgs while also campaigning in the east against the Safavids required immense resources, logistics, and manpower. The Janissary Corps, Sipahi cavalry, and provincial forces were stretched thin, and the need to maintain large garrisons along both frontiers meant that the empire often had to make difficult choices about where to deploy its strength. The shifting nature of warfare in the 16th and 17th centuries, with the increasing use of gunpowder, fortified bastions, and European-style armies, forced the Ottomans to adapt their tactics. The Long Turkish War, or the 15 Years' War 1593–1606, was one of the most prolonged and exhausting conflicts between the Ottomans and the Habsburgs. Fought mainly in Hungary and the Balkans, it drained the empire's treasury and exposed weaknesses in its administration. Although the war ended with the Treaty of Zitvatorok, which favored the Habsburgs diplomatically by elevating their status, the territorial changes were minimal. The war, however, signaled a gradual shift. The Ottomans were no longer the overwhelmingly dominant force they had been in the 16th century, and the Habsburgs began to consolidate their defenses and prepare for future conflicts. On the Eastern Front, the Treaty of Zuhab in 1639 between the Ottomans and the Safavids established a more enduring border, roughly along the lines of modern-day Iraq and Iran. This treaty marked the beginning of a relatively stable relationship, though tensions and occasional skirmishes persisted. The religious divide remained a defining feature, with the Ottomans promoting Sunni orthodoxy and the Safavids maintaining Shia dominance, each accusing the other of heresy and political subversion. The constant wars and rivalries with the Habsburgs and Safavids had a profound impact on Ottoman internal affairs. The financial burden of these conflicts led to increased taxation, reliance on tax farming, and, at times, debasement of currency. Provincial unrest often coincided with prolonged wars, as local governors exploited the empire's distractions to assert greater autonomy. The Janissaries, who were once a disciplined elite, became more politicized, demanding higher pay and resisting reforms. The need to appease both frontier garrisons and central power players created a delicate balancing act for the sultans. Culturally and diplomatically, however, These rivalries also opened the Ottoman world to greater interaction with Europe and Persia. Envoys, spies, and merchants crossed these contested borders, bringing new technologies, ideas, and goods. The Ottomans learned and at times adopted European fortification techniques, artillery designs, and military advisors. In the East, they negotiated pilgrimage routes to the holy cities and maintained a complex relationship with Shia scholars and merchants who operated under their rule. The failure of the Second Ottoman Siege of Vienna in 1683 marked a turning point in the struggle with the Habsburgs. This time, a united Christian force, including the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth led by King John III Sobieski, decisively defeated the Ottoman army, lifting the siege and initiating a Habsburg counteroffensive. The subsequent War of the Holy League 1683–1699 ended with the Treaty of Karlowitz, in which the Ottomans ceded significant territories in Hungary, Transylvania, and Croatia to the Habsburgs. This treaty marked the beginning of Ottoman territorial retreat in Europe and the loss of their long-held dominance along the Danube frontier. The Safavid threat, meanwhile, began to wane in the late 17th and early 18th centuries due to internal decline within Persia and the eventual fall of the Safavid dynasty to Afghan invaders. The Ottomans briefly took advantage of this chaos to capture territories in the Caucasus and western Iran, but these gains were often short-lived, and new Persian dynasties such as the Afsharids under Nader Shah emerged to challenge them again. Ultimately, the Ottoman confrontations with the Habsburgs and the Safavids shaped the empire's strategic outlook for centuries. They forced the Ottomans to build massive fortifications, maintain large standing armies, and develop diplomatic networks that extended from Paris to Isfahan. These rivalries also exposed the limitations of Ottoman power. The empire could conquer and hold vast territories, but prolonged multi-front wars revealed its logistical constraints and administrative vulnerabilities. The borders carved out in these struggles, especially the ones with the Safavids, influenced the modern boundaries of the Middle East. By the dawn of the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire was no longer the unstoppable force it had been in the days of Suleiman the Magnificent. The Habsburg monarchy had emerged as a dominant Central European power, and the eastern frontier had settled into an uneasy but lasting divide between Sunni Ottoman lands and Shia Persia. Yet, the centuries of conflict had left their mark. Fortresses, treaties, migration patterns, and sectarian divisions all bore witness to an era when the Ottomans stood between two powerful and relentless rivals, striving to maintain their empire at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. The Ottoman Empire, at the height of its power, was not defined only by its armies, its sultans, or its strategic territories. It was equally shaped by its culture, a vast and intricate web of artistic, architectural, and intellectual achievements that left a permanent imprint on the history of civilization. This period of flourishing did not arise overnight. It evolved over centuries, supported by imperial wealth, religious patronage, and a social structure that valued both spiritual beauty and scientific progress. At its center was a vision: to create an empire that reflected the glory of Islam, the legacy of earlier civilizations, and the ambitions of Ottoman rulers who saw themselves as guardians of both faith and empire. One of the most enduring legacies of this cultural flowering was architecture. Ottoman architecture, influenced by the Byzantine, Persian, and Islamic traditions, reached its zenith under the guidance of master architects, most notably Mimar Sinan. Sinan, often regarded as the greatest architect of the classical Ottoman era, served as the chief imperial architect under three sultans: Suleiman the Magnificent, Selim II, and Murad III. His works, numbering over 300, ranged from bridges and aqueducts to mosques and palaces. Among his masterpieces was the Suleimani Mosque in Istanbul, completed in 1557, which combined monumental scale with delicate artistry. Its cascading domes, towering minarets, and harmonious proportions reflected the grandeur of the Ottoman imperial vision. The Blue Mosque, or Sultan Ahmed Mosque, constructed later in the early 17th century, became another architectural jewel of the empire. With its 6 slender minarets, vast courtyard, and intricate Iznik tile work of blue and white arabesques, it symbolized both piety and imperial power. Ottoman mosques were not merely places of worship. They were complex social centers that included schools, hospitals, libraries, and markets, forming what were known as cullies. These architectural complexes embodied the Ottoman approach to urban development, the fusion of religious devotion, social welfare, and aesthetic harmony. Calligraphy, considered the highest form of Islamic art due to the sacred nature of the written word, also thrived under Ottoman patronage. Sultans often prided themselves on their own calligraphic skills, and the imperial court employed master calligraphers to produce Qurans, imperial decrees and monumental inscriptions. The Diwani script, characterized by its elaborate curves and decorative flourish, was developed in the Ottoman Chancery and became a hallmark of the empire's bureaucratic and artistic identity. Mosques, palaces and official documents bore the tugra, the stylized imperial signature of each sultan, often executed with extraordinary finesse. Alongside the visual arts, literature and poetry experienced significant development. Ottoman Turkish literature, written in a language rich with Persian and Arabic influences, produced epic poems, lyrical ghazals, and ornate prose that celebrated love, heroism and divine beauty. Court poets such as Baki and Fuseli composed verses that reflected both personal emotion and imperial grandeur. Historiography also thrived, with court historians chronicling the reigns of sultans and the major events of the empire in elaborate manuscripts often adorned with miniature paintings. Science and scholarship were essential pillars of Ottoman intellectual life. The empire inherited a vast body of knowledge from the Islamic Golden Age and from Byzantine traditions, and it continued to cultivate centers of learning. Madrasas, funded by WACs, charitable endowments, taught theology, law, mathematics, and astronomy. Medicine was a particularly esteemed discipline. Ottoman hospitals, many of which were integrated into mosque complexes, provided treatment based on both classical Islamic medicine and emerging practices influenced by European contact. One of the most notable figures in Ottoman science was Taqi al-Din, a 16th-century polymath who established an observatory in Istanbul in 1577. He made significant contributions to astronomy, mechanics, and optics, producing detailed astronomical tables and improving upon existing devices. His work, though eventually suppressed due to political and religious pressures, demonstrated the Ottoman engagement with scientific inquiry during a time when Europe was entering its own scientific revolution. The Ottomans also made advances in cartography and geography, fueled by their control over key trade routes and their encounters with diverse lands. Piri Reis, a renowned admiral and cartographer, produced one of the most famous early world maps in 1513, depicting parts of Europe, Africa, and the Americas with remarkable accuracy for its time. His Book of Navigation combined detailed charts with sailing instructions, becoming a crucial resource for Ottoman naval expansion. Music and performing arts formed another dimension of this cultural richness. Ottoman classical music, influenced by Persian, Arab, and Central Asian traditions, developed complex modes known as makams. The court employed musicians, composers, and dancers who performed during ceremonies, banquets, and festivals. Sufi orders, particularly the Mevlevis, integrated music and dance into their spiritual practices, with the whirling dervishes becoming an enduring symbol of Ottoman mysticism. This cultural flourishing was not limited to the elite alone, it permeated urban life. Istanbul, the imperial capital, became a magnet for artisans, scholars, and merchants from across the empire. Markets bustled with textiles, ceramics, carpets, and manuscripts, many of which carried the distinctive Ottoman artistic style. Provincial cities such as Edirne, Bursa, and Damascus also benefited from imperial patronage, developing their own architectural landmarks and cultural institutions. However, the empire's cultural achievements were not immune to the forces of change. The growing influence of European art and science in the 17th and 18th centuries began to introduce new styles, techniques, and ideas. Baroque and Rococo elements found their way into later Ottoman palaces and mosques, while printing technology, initially resisted, eventually began to challenge the dominance of manuscript culture. Yet even as the empire adapted, it retained a unique synthesis of influences, Islamic, Byzantine, Persian, and European, that gave Ottoman culture its enduring character. The role of religion, particularly Islam, was central to this cultural landscape. Patronage of the arts and sciences was often framed as an expression of piety and a means of strengthening the empire's religious foundations. Sultans commissioned Qurans, sponsored pilgrimage routes, and endowed institutions that combined worship with learning. The Ottoman understanding of culture was thus inseparable from its understanding of faith. Beauty was seen as a reflection of divine order, and knowledge as a path to both temporal and spiritual power. By the 17th century, the Ottomans had created a legacy of cultural production that rivaled the greatest empires of history. Their mosques and palaces still define the skylines of cities like Istanbul. Their manuscripts and textiles are preserved in museums worldwide. Their music and calligraphy continue to inspire contemporary artists. This period of flourishing was not merely an ornament to imperial might, it was one of the foundations upon which the empire's identity rested. As the centuries progressed, the challenges of modernization, military competition, and political reform would test this cultural heritage. Yet even in decline, the Ottomans remained conscious of their role as patrons of art and learning. Their legacy was not erased by the fall of the empire in the early 20th century. Rather, it became a source of pride and continuity for the modern nations that emerged from its territories. The story of Ottoman cultural flourishing is, therefore, not just a chapter in imperial history. It is a reminder of how empires shape and are shaped by the creativity of their people. From the domes of the Blue Mosque to the intricate lines of Diwani calligraphy, from the astronomical tables of Taqi al-Din to the whirling dervishes of Konya, the empire's cultural achievements continue to speak across the centuries, testaments to a time when art, architecture, and science were as much instruments of power as they were expressions of the human spirit. The 17th century marked the beginning of a gradual transformation within the Ottoman Empire, a period where signs of weakness began to appear in a system that had once seemed unstoppable. The empire that had expanded under Suleiman the Magnificent now faced an era of growing challenges, political, military, and economic, that would plant the seeds of decline. It was not an immediate collapse, but rather a slow erosion of the very structures that had sustained Ottoman power for centuries. Corruption began to creep into the heart of the administration. Positions in government, once granted on the basis of merit and loyalty, were increasingly sold to the highest bidder. This practice, known as the sale of offices, enriched a few but weakened the integrity of the empire. Pashas and governors often paid large sums for their appointments and then sought to recover these expenses by heavily taxing the populations they ruled. This exploitation bred resentment among subjects and disrupted the delicate balance of trust that had once defined Ottoman governance. The Janissaries, once the elite backbone of the Ottoman military, also became a source of instability. Originally recruited through the Devshirme system, these soldiers had been disciplined, loyal, and highly trained. Over time, however, their corps turned into a powerful political force resistant to reform. They became involved in palace intrigues, often deciding the fate of sultans and ministers. Instead of being a professional fighting force, many Janissaries grew comfortable with privileges and stipends, resisting calls to modernize or adopt new tactics. Their influence within the empire shifted from defending its borders to guarding their own interests, which often conflicted with the needs of the state. Military setbacks further eroded Ottoman dominance. The empire faced new challenges on multiple fronts: wars with the Habsburg monarchy in Europe, tensions with the Safavid Empire in the east, and increasing naval rivalry with European powers in the Mediterranean. The once fearsome Ottoman army found it difficult to keep pace with the rapidly advancing military technologies and strategies employed by its European rivals. Firearms and artillery had transformed the nature of warfare, but reforms to update the Ottoman army were slow, often blocked by entrenched interests within the Janissary corps and conservative factions at court. One of the most symbolic defeats of the era came in the late 17th century during the failed siege of Vienna in 1683. The Ottoman forces, under Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, sought to capture the Austrian capital and expand further into Europe. However, the siege ended in disaster when a coalition of European forces, led by King John III Sobieski of Poland, launched a decisive counterattack. The defeat not only halted Ottoman expansion in Central Europe but also marked the beginning of a slow retreat from the continent. In the years that followed, treaties such as the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 forced the empire to cede significant territories, including parts of Hungary, Transylvania, and Croatia, to the Habsburgs and their allies. Economically, the Ottoman Empire began to feel the strain of changing global trade patterns. The age of exploration had opened new maritime routes around Africa and across the Atlantic, shifting the center of world trade away from the Mediterranean. The Ottoman-controlled trade hubs, once vital for connecting East and West, lost their centrality as European powers like Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, and later Britain and France developed direct trade routes to Asia and the Americas. This decline in trade revenue weakened the empire's ability to finance its military campaigns and maintain its vast bureaucracy. Taxation became an increasingly heavy burden on the population. As corruption spread and wars drained the treasury, the state relied more heavily on tax farming, a system in which individuals or groups paid for the right to collect taxes in a given region. These tax farmers often exploited peasants and merchants, extracting as much as they could with little concern for the long-term prosperity of the lands they managed. Rural communities, already struggling with poor harvests and rising costs, faced worsening conditions, which led to social unrest and migration to urban centers. In the countryside, banditry and rebellion became more frequent. Local notables, known as ayans, began to amass power at the expense of central authority. They often controlled militias, collected taxes independently, and challenged the sultan's representatives. This decentralization weakened the cohesion of the empire and made it more difficult to enforce laws and maintain order across its far-reaching provinces. The cultural and intellectual climate of the 17th century also reflected the empire's growing stagnation. While art, architecture, and literature continued to flourish in certain circles, there was a noticeable reluctance to embrace new scientific and technological innovations emerging in Europe. The printing press, for example, had been introduced in Europe in the 15th century and revolutionized access to knowledge, but its adoption in the Ottoman Empire was slow and resisted by conservative religious authorities who feared its impact on traditional structures of learning and authority. Religious institutions, which had long been a source of unity and moral guidance, also became arenas of political maneuvering. The ulama, religious scholars, held significant influence in matters of law and education, but their increasing involvement in politics often led to factionalism. Some sultans and grand viziers attempted reforms to modernize administration and reduce corruption, but these efforts were frequently undermined by entrenched interests that profited from the status quo. The sultanate itself underwent a transformation during this century. The practice of confining potential heirs in the palace, known as the kafes system, meant that many future sultans grew up in isolation, lacking administrative experience and broader vision. As a result, several rulers of this period were seen as weak or easily manipulated by court factions, powerful mothers, valide sultans, or grand viziers. This contributed to a sense of instability at the top of the empire's hierarchy. Despite these challenges, the Ottoman Empire in the 17th century was far from collapsing. It remained a vast and powerful state stretching across 3 continents, with a rich cultural life and a strong agricultural base. Its decline was gradual and uneven, with moments of recovery and reform interspersed throughout the century. Some provinces continued to thrive, trade persisted in many regions, and the empire maintained its status as a major power in both the Islamic and European worlds. However, the warning signs were unmistakable. Corruption weakened the integrity of the administration, military stagnation left the empire vulnerable to its rivals, economic shifts reduced its revenues, and internal unrest eroded the authority of the central government. The seeds of decline planted in this period would bear heavier fruit in the centuries to come, as European powers grew stronger and more industrialized while the Ottoman Empire struggled to adapt to the rapidly changing world. In retrospect, the 17th century can be seen as a turning point, a time when the empire began to move from an era of confident expansion to one of cautious defense. It was a century marked by both resilience and decay, where the brilliance of past achievements still shone but the cracks in the foundation had begun to spread. The challenges faced in this period would force future rulers to choose between reform and resistance, modernization and tradition, as they sought to navigate the increasingly complex landscape of global politics and economics. The 18th century marked a turbulent period for the Ottoman Empire. After centuries of dominance, the empire faced growing internal weaknesses and external pressures that exposed its declining power. The Treaty of Karlowitz, signed in 1699, had already dealt a significant blow by forcing the Ottomans to cede vast territories in Central Europe to the Habsburg monarchy, Poland, Lithuania, and Venice. This treaty was not merely a territorial loss but a symbolic turning point that highlighted the changing balance of power in Europe. No longer were the Ottomans the undisputed conquerors. Now they were a state forced into negotiation and compromise. The aftermath of Karlowitz forced the Ottoman leadership to confront a sobering reality. The empire could no longer rely on traditional methods of governance, warfare, and diplomacy. European powers were advancing rapidly in military technology, administrative efficiency, and economic strategies shaped by the early stages of industrialization and mercantilism. Meanwhile, the Ottoman system, once a model of flexible yet firm rule, had become rigid and plagued by corruption, factionalism, and outdated institutions. Efforts at reform began to emerge, albeit cautiously and inconsistently. The early 18th century, under Sultan Ahmed III (1703–1730), saw the period known as the Tulip Era, L'Âge d'Ivry, which symbolized a brief flowering of culture, art, and diplomacy inspired by European models. While often remembered for its lavish gardens, tulip festivals, and ornate palaces along the Bosphorus, this era also represented the first serious attempt to absorb European influences into Ottoman society without fully abandoning traditional structures. The Tulip Era was marked by attempts to modernize the military, though these reforms were modest compared to later efforts. European-style artillery schools were established, and some foreign experts were invited to share their knowledge. Diplomacy with European courts became more regularized, and permanent embassies were set up in major capitals, such as Paris and Vienna. These embassies not only strengthened diplomatic channels but also served as windows through which Ottoman elites observed European scientific, technological and cultural advances. However, reform efforts during this time were limited by resistance from powerful conservative groups within the empire. The Janissaries, who had once been an elite military corps, had become politically influential and resistant to change. Their privileges, corruption and declining discipline made them a significant obstacle to meaningful military reform. Similarly, religious scholars, ulama, and provincial notables feared that European-inspired changes would undermine their influence. The Ottoman economy during the 18th century remained largely agrarian and dependent on traditional trade routes that were increasingly bypassed by European maritime powers. The rise of global trade networks dominated by Britain, France, and the Netherlands reduced the empire's central role in East-West commerce. Inflation, debasement of currency, and uneven taxation contributed to social unrest and weakened state revenues. Smuggling and corruption in provincial administrations further eroded the economic base that had once supported the empire's vast bureaucracy and army. One of the key military defeats of this period was the ongoing conflict with Russia. The Russo-Turkish Wars of the 18th century gradually chipped away at Ottoman dominance in the Black Sea region. The Treaty of Passarowitz in 1718 marked another territorial loss, ceding parts of Serbia and Wallachia to the Habsburgs, though it also opened trade with Austria and Venice, creating some economic opportunities. The empire oscillated between war and diplomacy as it attempted to preserve its shrinking influence. Reform-minded grand viziers occasionally pushed for modernization, but their efforts were often short-lived due to court intrigues, rebellions and shifting political alliances. The Patrona Halil Revolt of 1730, for instance, brought an abrupt end to the Tulip era, as conservative forces rose against what they perceived as excessive Europeanization and courtly extravagance. Despite these setbacks, the Ottomans did not remain entirely stagnant. The later part of the century saw renewed attempts at military reform, particularly under Sultan Selim III, r. 1789 to 1807. Recognizing the widening gap between the Ottoman army and those of European powers, Selim III established the Nizam-i-Sedid New Order army, trained and equipped along European lines. This force, however, faced fierce opposition from the entrenched Janissaries and was ultimately suppressed, leading to Selim's deposition. Throughout the century, the empire also witnessed a gradual intellectual awakening. Ottoman scholars, diplomats, and reformers increasingly engaged with European ideas in science, engineering, and administration. Printing presses became more common, though still regulated, and a cautious interest in Western learning grew among the elite. However, these changes were piecemeal and rarely penetrated the broader fabric of Ottoman society, which remained rooted in traditional structures. The Treaty of Kukuk-Kaynarca in 1774 was another severe blow to the empire. Signed after a disastrous war with Russia, it granted Russia significant territorial gains and, more importantly, the right to protect Orthodox Christians within the empire. This provision provided Russia with a pretext to interfere in Ottoman affairs and further weaken the Sultan's authority over his diverse subjects. By the end of the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire was a shadow of its former self. Though still vast, stretching across the Balkans, Anatolia, the Levant, North Africa, and parts of the Arabian Peninsula, it was increasingly vulnerable to both external aggression and internal fragmentation. Provincial governors and local warlords gained autonomy, reducing the central government's ability to enforce reforms or collect taxes effectively. The attempts at reform during this century laid the groundwork for more ambitious transformations in the 19th century, but they also revealed the deep resistance entrenched in the empire's political and social fabric. Every move toward modernization provoked backlash from vested interests, Janissaries, conservative ulama, and provincial elites, who feared losing their privileges. At the same time, European powers exploited Ottoman weaknesses through diplomacy, trade, and war, ensuring that any steps forward were often followed by setbacks. Thus, the 18th century was a period of transition, hesitation, and missed opportunities. It was neither a time of total collapse nor of successful renewal, but rather a century in which the Ottomans struggled to reconcile their imperial traditions with the rapidly changing realities of the modern world. The seeds of more profound reforms were planted, but they would only bear fruit, often painfully, in the decades to come. However, modernization was an expensive endeavor, and the empire's financial situation was precarious. The Ottoman economy in the early 19th century was heavily agrarian, with inefficient tax farming systems draining wealth from the peasantry while enriching intermediaries. Foreign trade was increasingly dominated by European merchants under the capitulation system, which granted them significant privileges and undermined local industries. To finance reforms, the Ottoman government resorted to foreign loans, a decision that would later trap the empire in a web of debt and dependency. The empire's territorial integrity was also under constant threat during this period. In the Balkans, nationalist movements inspired by the ideals of the French Revolution and supported by European powers began to rise. The Greek War of Independence, 1821 to 1829, was a particularly devastating blow. Despite initial Ottoman victories, European intervention, culminating in the Battle of Navarino in 1827, where a combined British, French and Russian fleet destroyed the Ottoman Egyptian navy, secured Greek independence. This marked the beginning of a long process of territorial loss in Europe, as Serbia, Wallachia, and Moldavia also gained increasing autonomy. To the east, the empire faced persistent challenges from the Russian Empire, whose ambitions in the Black Sea and the Caucasus were growing. The Russo-Turkish wars of the early 19th century further weakened Ottoman control over the Danubian principalities and the Caucasus. The Treaty of Adrianople, 1829, forced the Ottomans to make significant concessions, including the recognition of Greek independence and granting Russia influence over key territories. It was against this backdrop of territorial contraction and external pressure that the Tanzimat era formally began. The word Tanzimat means reorganization, and it referred to a series of imperial edicts and reforms initiated between 1839 and 1876. Sultan Abdülmecid I, who ascended the throne in 1839, was a young ruler determined to continue the modernization efforts begun by Mahmud II. On November 3, 1839, the Hat-i-Sharif of Gulhane was proclaimed, laying the foundation for a new legal and administrative order. This landmark decree promised security of life, honor and property to all subjects of the empire, regardless of religion or ethnicity. It also introduced measures to regularize taxation, reform military conscription and ensure fair trials. The Tanzimat reforms were revolutionary in their intent. For the first time, the Ottoman state openly declared its commitment to equality before the law for all its subjects, Muslims, Christians and Jews alike. This was not merely a matter of principle but a pragmatic attempt to prevent the disintegration of the empire by winning the loyalty of its diverse populations and appeasing European powers that often used the mistreatment of Christians as a pretext for intervention. Education was another critical area of reform. New secular schools were established alongside traditional religious institutions, and efforts were made to modernize curricula by including sciences, mathematics, and foreign languages. The first Ottoman universities and technical schools began to appear, training a new generation of bureaucrats, engineers, and officers who would serve the modernizing state. Printing presses multiplied, newspapers spread new ideas, and intellectual debates flourished in the cosmopolitan cities of Istanbul, Smyrna, and Salonika. Yet the Tanzimat was not universally welcomed. Conservative elements within the empire, including segments of the ulama, religious scholars, and traditional guilds, viewed these reforms as an erosion of Islamic law and Ottoman tradition. They resented the increasing influence of Europeans, whose advisors and financiers often guided reform policies. Moreover, the promise of equality between Muslims and non-Muslims provoked unease among many Muslims who saw it as an affront to their historic privileges. Despite these tensions, the first phase of the Tanzimat, 1839 to 1856, laid the groundwork for significant transformations. New commercial and criminal codes were introduced, inspired by European models, particularly the French legal system. A modern postal service was established, telegraph lines began to connect distant provinces, and the empire's first railways were constructed, linking key cities and facilitating trade. Foreign relations during this period were dominated by the so-called Eastern Question, the strategic rivalry between European powers over the fate of the Ottoman Empire. Britain and France, concerned about Russian expansion, often supported the Ottoman state as a bulwark against Russian ambitions. This alignment became evident during the Crimean War 1853 to 1856, when Britain and France allied with the Ottomans against Russia. The war ended with the Treaty of Paris, which temporarily secured the empire's territorial integrity and brought it into the concert of Europe. However, the costs of war and reform were mounting. Foreign loans taken to finance infrastructure, military modernization, and bureaucratic expansion began to accumulate. By the mid-19th century, the empire's debt had become a growing burden, leading to increasing European financial oversight. The seeds of financial dependency sown in this era would later blossom into the establishment of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration in the 1880s. By the mid-century, the Tanzimat reforms had achieved a mixed record. On one hand, they had introduced vital elements of modernization: legal equality, modern education, infrastructure, and improved administration. On the other, they had failed to fully stem the tide of territorial losses and economic decline. The empire remained heavily reliant on European powers, both politically and financially, and nationalist movements in the Balkans continued to grow, threatening further fragmentation. The second phase of the Tanzimat reforms, beginning in the 1850s and continuing into the 1870s, sought to deepen and expand the changes already underway. Sultan Abdulaziz R. 1861 to 1876, and his reformist ministers such as Ali Pasha and Fuad Pasha, carried forward the legacy of Mahmud II and Abdulmajid I, believing that only a thoroughly modernized state could withstand the pressures of a rapidly industrializing Europe. One of the key pillars of this phase was the continued modernization of the military. The Ottoman army adopted more advanced weaponry, improved its training systems, and expanded its officer corps through European-style academies. The navy, which had been devastated during earlier conflicts, was rebuilt with the assistance of British shipbuilders, making it one of the largest fleets in the world by the 1870s. Railways were extended, particularly in the Balkans and Anatolia, not only to facilitate trade but also to enable rapid troop movement in the face of rising nationalist revolts. Administrative reforms also continued. Provincial councils were established, bringing a measure of local representation to governance, though ultimate authority remained with the Sultan and his ministers. The new administrative divisions sought to weaken the power of local notables and create a more uniform system of taxation and law enforcement. Cadastral surveys were undertaken to better assess land ownership and revenue potential, often leading to disputes but gradually improving state finances. The Tanzimat era also saw significant legal milestones. In 1856, the Hat-i-Humayun Imperial Edict was issued, reaffirming the principles of equality among all subjects and expanding them further. This edict, proclaimed under European pressure at the end of the Crimean War, abolished certain discriminatory taxes on Christians and Jews, allowed them to serve in the military, and granted them greater access to state offices. For many Muslim conservatives, this went too far, provoking unrest and resistance, while for European powers, it still fell short of true equality. Education and intellectual life continued to flourish during this time. New schools for girls were opened, marking a gradual, though limited, expansion of women's access to education. Printing presses published not only newspapers but also novels, scientific treatises, and translations of European works. Istanbul emerged as a vibrant intellectual hub, where reformers, journalists, and bureaucrats debated the future of the empire. Among the younger generation, a group known as the Young Ottomans began to advocate for constitutionalism and parliamentary governance, blending Islamic thought with European political ideas. Yet for all these advances, the Ottoman Empire faced growing internal and external challenges. Nationalist movements in the Balkans intensified, fueled by both the reforms' promises of equality and their perceived shortcomings. The 1860s and 1870s saw uprisings in Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Bulgaria, often met with brutal suppression that drew European condemnation and intervention. The dream of uniting the empire's diverse peoples under a common Ottoman identity, a vision known as Ottomanism, was increasingly undermined by ethnic and religious divisions. Economically, the empire's reliance on foreign loans deepened. Extravagant spending on palaces, railways, and the navy strained the treasury, while global market shifts undermined traditional industries such as textile production. The Ottoman state declared partial bankruptcy in 1875, a financial crisis that would lead to the establishment of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration in 1881, effectively placing key revenues under European control. This loss of economic sovereignty was a humiliating blow to the empire's prestige and further fueled discontent among reformist and nationalist circles. Amid these difficulties, the Tanzimat era reached its political climax with the promulgation of the Ottoman Constitution in 1876. Driven by the young Ottomans and accepted by Sultan Abdulhamid II upon his accession to the throne, the constitution introduced a bicameral parliament, guaranteed basic rights, and promised regular elections. For the first time, the Ottoman Empire appeared to be taking a decisive step toward constitutional monarchy and modern governance. However, this experiment was short-lived. The outbreak of the Russo-Turkish War 1877–1878, dealt a devastating blow to the empire, leading to massive territorial losses in the Balkans and the Caucasus. The Treaty of San Stefano and the subsequent Congress of Berlin stripped the empire of vast lands, including Romania, Serbia, Montenegro, and parts of Bulgaria, while granting autonomy to others. Faced with these humiliations and believing that strong central authority was essential for survival, Sultan Abdülhamid II suspended the constitution in 1878 and ruled as an autocrat for the next 3 decades. The legacy of the Tanzimat reforms, therefore, was complex. On one hand, they represented the most ambitious attempt in centuries to modernize the Ottoman Empire. They introduced legal equality, modern education, infrastructure, and a professional bureaucracy. They opened the empire to global trade and cultural exchange, and they produced a generation of reform-minded elites who would continue to shape Ottoman and Turkish history. On the other hand, they failed to resolve the fundamental challenges of the empire: nationalist separatism, economic dependency, and the struggle to reconcile Islamic tradition with European modernity. In the provinces, the impact of the reforms varied widely. In some areas, particularly in the major cities and along key trade routes, they brought tangible improvements: better roads, more predictable taxes, new schools, and more responsive administration. In others, they were seen as distant decrees imposed by a central government increasingly under European influence. Resistance, both passive and active, was common, and many rural regions remained largely untouched by the grand reforms proclaimed in Istanbul. The Tanzimat era also set the stage for new political movements that would emerge in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Young Ottomans' ideas would evolve into the Young Turk movement, which eventually overthrew the absolute rule of Abdülhamid II and restored the constitution in 1908. The debates of the Tanzimat period, about centralization versus decentralization, Islam versus secularism, reform versus tradition, would continue to shape the destiny of the empire until its final collapse in World War I. Culturally, the Tanzimat fostered a flowering of literature, art, and journalism that reflected the tensions and hopes of the age. Writers such as Namik Kemal championed freedom and patriotism, while poets and playwrights experimented with new forms inspired by European models. The Ottoman elite embraced elements of Western fashion, architecture, and lifestyle, creating a hybrid culture visible in the boulevards of Istanbul and the palaces along the Bosphorus. By the end of the 19th century, the Tanzimat had left an indelible mark on the Ottoman Empire. It had not saved the empire from decline, but it had transformed its institutions and prepared the ground for the final, tumultuous century of its existence. The dream of a modern, united Ottoman state remained elusive, yet the reforms had planted the seeds of future change. Seeds that would bear fruit in both the late Ottoman constitutional movements and the eventual birth of the modern Turkish Republic. By the dawn of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire found itself ruling over a patchwork of peoples across the Balkans, many of whom had distinct languages, religions, and cultural identities. For centuries, Ottoman administration had managed to maintain relative stability through the millet system, allowing Christians, Jews, and Muslims to live under their own religious laws while paying taxes to the Sultan. Yet the winds of change that swept across Europe, sparked by the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and the Napoleonic Wars, began to erode this balance. Nationalism, a concept that placed the identity of a people above the empire that ruled them, started to take root among the diverse populations of southeastern Europe. The Balkans were a complex mosaic. Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, Romanians, Albanians, Bosniaks, and others lived side by side, often with overlapping loyalties and histories. The Orthodox Church, long a central pillar of Christian life under Ottoman rule, became a crucial force for preserving language and culture. Secret societies, intellectual circles, and diaspora communities in Western Europe began to whisper about independence. The Ottomans, still recovering from earlier wars and reforms, initially underestimated the power of these ideas. They viewed local uprisings as manageable revolts rather than the early flames of a movement that would shake their European dominions to the core. The first major crack in Ottoman authority came with the Serbian uprisings in the early 19th century. The first Serbian uprising, 1804 to 1813, led by Karađorđe Petrović, was sparked by abuses committed by Janissary leaders in the region. What began as a local rebellion grew into a national liberation movement, drawing inspiration from both Russian support and the broader currents of European nationalism. Although the Ottomans managed to suppress the first uprising, the second Serbian uprising in 1815, led by Miloš Obrenović, forced the empire to grant Serbia a degree of autonomy. This was a turning point. It demonstrated that the empire was no longer an unshakable power in the Balkans and that the idea of national self-rule was achievable. Meanwhile, Greece became the cradle of a much larger and more symbolic struggle. The Greek War of Independence, 1821 to 1830, was not merely a regional uprising, it captured the imagination of Europe. Poets like Lord Byron championed the Greek cause, and the European powers, particularly Britain, France and Russia, saw in it an opportunity to weaken Ottoman influence. The brutal conflict, marked by massacres, sieges and naval battles, eventually led to the intervention of the great powers at the Battle of Navarino in 1827. Their victory against the Ottoman Egyptian fleet sealed the fate of Ottoman control in Greece. By 1830, Greece became the first fully independent nation to break away from the empire, setting a precedent for others to follow. These losses were not just territorial, they were psychological. For centuries, the Ottomans had considered their European provinces as vital to the empire's wealth and prestige. The Balkans were rich in trade routes, agricultural land and manpower. Losing Greece sent a message to other subject peoples. The empire could be challenged and defeated with the right alliances and persistence. At the same time, it revealed the growing entanglement of European powers in Ottoman affairs. From this point onward, Balkan nationalism would not only be a local struggle but also a battlefield for the rivalries of Russia, Austria, Britain, and later Germany. Throughout the mid-19th century, the empire attempted to respond with reforms. The Tanzimat era, launched in 1839, promised equality for all subjects regardless of religion. In theory, this was meant to bind Christians and Muslims more closely to the Ottoman state, giving them a sense of shared citizenship. In practice, however, it often fueled nationalist aspirations further. Many Christian communities interpreted these reforms as an opportunity to press for more autonomy, while Muslims in the provinces sometimes resented the erosion of their traditional privileges. Instead of healing divisions, the reforms often deepened them. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, marked another moment when the Balkans became a theater for great power politics. The Ottomans, backed by Britain and France, fought against Russia to prevent its expansion into Ottoman territory and influence over Orthodox Christians. Although the Ottomans emerged on the winning side, the war exposed the empire's dependence on European support. It also left many Balkan peoples with the impression that their fate was tied to the shifting alliances of Europe, not solely to the decisions made in Constantinople. By the late 19th century, the tide of nationalism was rising more rapidly. Bulgaria, a region with a strong Orthodox and Slavic identity, saw the rise of revolutionary committees and uprisings. The April Uprising of 1876, though brutally suppressed by Ottoman forces, became a rallying cry for European intervention. Reports of atrocities committed during the suppression of the rebellion fueled outrage in Europe, particularly in Britain and Russia. This paved the way for the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878, which proved catastrophic for the Ottomans. The war ended with the Treaty of San Stefano, later revised by the Congress of Berlin, which granted independence or autonomy to several Balkan states. Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro gained full independence, while Bulgaria became an autonomous principality under nominal Ottoman suzerainty. Each of these losses chipped away at Ottoman authority and prestige. Where once the empire had been the dominant power in southeastern Europe, it now found itself retreating steadily toward its Anatolian and Middle Eastern heartlands. The Balkan question, how to manage the aspirations of these diverse peoples while maintaining imperial control, became a constant source of diplomatic crisis. The European powers often played one group against another, exploiting nationalist movements to weaken the empire further. At the same time, the social fabric of the Balkans was changing. The rise of print culture, newspapers, and nationalist literature helped spread new ideas to urban centers and rural villages alike. Schools funded by diaspora communities or foreign missionaries taught young generations their national histories rather than the Ottoman imperial narrative. Secret societies and revolutionary networks flourished, often supported by émigrés in Paris, Vienna, or Moscow. For the Ottomans, suppressing these movements became increasingly difficult, not only because of their growing sophistication but also because European powers often provided them with diplomatic or material support. By the close of the 19th century, the Balkans had become a powder keg. The Ottoman Empire still held significant territories, Macedonia, Kosovo, Albania, Bosnia, and parts of Thrace, but the ground beneath its feet was eroding. Nationalism had transformed from isolated revolts into a sweeping force that redefined borders, alliances, and identities. The empire's response, a mix of reform, repression, and negotiation, was never quite enough to stem the tide. As the 20th century approached, the Ottoman Empire faced an increasingly unstable situation in the Balkans. The seeds planted by earlier nationalist uprisings had now grown into well-organized political movements, armed groups, and in many cases, full-fledged revolutionary organizations. These movements were no longer isolated or easily suppressed. They were interconnected, often receiving external funding, training, and diplomatic backing. Bosnia and Herzegovina became a focal point of tension. Officially still part of the Ottoman Empire, the provinces were occupied and administered by Austria-Hungary after the Congress of Berlin in 1878. This arrangement angered both the local population and the Ottoman authorities, but the empire lacked the strength to reverse it. The loss of direct control over Bosnia symbolized the creeping influence of the Habsburg monarchy and the decline of Ottoman sovereignty in Europe. It also stoked resentment among Serbs and other Slavic groups who saw their lands being partitioned by outside powers. In Macedonia, a region with a diverse population of Greeks, Bulgarians, Serbs, Vlachs, and Albanians, nationalist movements competed fiercely for influence. Guerrilla bands, known as komitadjis, fought not only against Ottoman troops but also against each other, seeking to assert their vision of the region's future. Schools, churches, and local militias became battlegrounds for cultural dominance. The Ottoman administration, overstretched and often corrupt, struggled to maintain order. Its strategy oscillated between repression, deploying troops to crush uprisings, and appeasement, granting limited reforms or concessions to pacify local leaders. Neither approach brought lasting stability. The rise of Albanian nationalism added another layer of complexity. Unlike many of their Balkan neighbors, Albanians were divided among Muslims, Catholics, and Orthodox Christians, making their movement less tied to religion and more focused on language and autonomy. The League of Prizren, formed in 1878, demanded the unification of Albanian inhabited territories and greater self-rule within the Ottoman framework. While initially supported by some Ottoman reformers as a buffer against Slavic expansion, Albanian aspirations eventually clashed with the empire's centralizing policies. The empire also faced growing unrest among its Muslim populations in the Balkans. Many Muslim refugees, known as muhacirs, fled from newly independent Balkan states into Ottoman lands, particularly in Macedonia, Kosovo, and Anatolia. Their stories of persecution and displacement fueled resentment and hardened attitudes within the empire, creating a cycle of distrust between different religious and ethnic groups. Economically, the Ottoman Empire's hold over the Balkans was weakening as well. The expansion of European railways and shipping routes bypassed traditional Ottoman trade centers, while the empire's increasing dependence on European loans and investments limited its ability to act independently. Foreign companies gained concessions to build infrastructure, extract resources, and control key industries. This created a dual economy in many Balkan provinces, one tied to the Ottoman state and another increasingly integrated into European markets. By the early 20th century, the situation reached a boiling point. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 briefly raised hopes for a more unified and modern Ottoman state. The new constitutional regime promised equality for all citizens and sought to curb the power of corrupt officials and military cliques. In the Balkans, some nationalist leaders welcomed this as a chance to secure peaceful reform, while others saw it as a facade meant to delay independence. Within a few years, disillusionment set in as the promised reforms failed to deliver substantial autonomy. Then came the Balkan Wars, 1912 to 1913, a decisive chapter in the region's history and a catastrophic blow to the Ottoman Empire. The First Balkan War saw a coalition of Balkan states, Serbia, Montenegro, Greece, and Bulgaria, launch a coordinated attack to expel the Ottomans from their remaining European territories. The empire's army, already weakened by internal divisions and outdated structures, was unable to mount an effective defense. Within months, almost all of the Ottoman Balkans were lost, with only a small strip of Thrace, including Edirne, Adrianople, remaining under Ottoman control. The Second Balkan War erupted shortly after, this time among the victorious Balkan states themselves, as they fought over the spoils of their conquest. Although the Ottomans managed to recover some territory in eastern Thrace during this conflict, their position in the Balkans was irreparably shattered. Millions of Muslims fled or were expelled, adding to the growing refugee crisis in Anatolia and the empire's remaining provinces. The aftermath of the Balkan Wars left deep scars. For the peoples of the Balkans, it meant the realization of long-held nationalist dreams, though often at the cost of new conflicts and shifting borders. For the Ottoman Empire, it was both a humiliation and a warning. Its European era was over, and the empire was now largely an Anatolian and Middle Eastern power. The loss of the Balkans deprived the empire of vital agricultural lands, trade routes and human resources. It also accelerated its financial dependence on European powers and its vulnerability to external manipulation. Politically, the defeat in the Balkans emboldened radical elements within the Ottoman leadership. The Committee of Union and Progress (CUP), which had risen to power after the Young Turk Revolution, began to pursue more authoritarian and nationalist policies. They sought to centralize control, modernize the army and suppress dissent, believing that only a strong unified core could save the empire from total collapse. However, these policies often alienated minority groups further, setting the stage for more conflicts during the First World War. Culturally and socially, the loss of the Balkans had a profound impact on Ottoman identity. For centuries, the empire had seen itself as a bridge between Europe and Asia, with the Balkans as a vital component of its heritage. The departure of these territories forced a re-evaluation of what it meant to be Ottoman. Refugee communities carried their memories, traditions and grievances into the heartlands of the empire, influencing politics, art and social life. In the international arena, the Balkan question continued to haunt Europe. The shifting borders and rivalries left unresolved after the Balkan Wars contributed directly to the tensions that sparked World War I. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in 1914, a city that had once been firmly under Ottoman control, was a grim symbol of how the region remained at the heart of global conflict. By the eve of World War I, the Ottoman Empire's presence in Europe was reduced to a shadow of its former self. The long struggle against Balkan nationalism, marked by reforms, wars and diplomacy, had ended in retreat and loss. The empire would now face its final challenges not in the rolling hills of the Balkans, but in the deserts of the Middle East and the battlefields of the Great War. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire stood at a crossroads between collapse and rebirth. For decades, its territories had been shrinking, its finances drained by foreign debts, and its army weakened by outdated practices. In this tense and fragile environment, a group of reformist intellectuals, officers and political activists began to gather under a new banner, the Young Turks. Their aim was to end the autocratic rule of Sultan Abdul Hamid II and restore the suspended Ottoman constitution of 1876. Their movement would reshape the empire's political landscape and set the stage for one of the most catastrophic chapters in Ottoman history, its entry into the First World War. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 was born out of frustration with stagnation, corruption, and external pressure. The empire had suffered humiliating defeats in the Balkan Wars, lost territories in North Africa, and become a pawn in the power games of Europe. Abdul Hamid II, ruling with an iron fist, had suspended the constitution decades earlier, concentrating power in his hands and using censorship, secret police and loyalty networks to suppress dissent. But under this surface of control, opposition was brewing. Secret societies of reformist officers and students in the military academies of Salonika, modern-day Thessaloniki, Monastir and Constantinople began to organize. Among them, the Committee of Union and Progress (CUP) emerged as the most influential. The CUP was a coalition of various ideologies, liberals, nationalists and reformists, but it was united in its belief that the empire needed a modern constitutional government to survive. Many of its members were educated in Europe or influenced by European political thought, believing that only a modernized army, a transparent administration and centralized authority could protect the empire from further dismemberment. In 1908, seizing the moment of international distraction with other European crises, the CUP launched a revolution. In July 1908, faced with growing mutiny within the army and pressure from multiple fronts, Sultan Abdul Hamid II reluctantly agreed to restore the constitution and recall the parliament. It was a moment of celebration across the empire. Crowds filled the streets of Constantinople, Salonika and Damascus, waving flags and chanting for liberty and unity. Newspapers flourished overnight, censorship was lifted, and a new sense of hope swept across the multi-ethnic Ottoman territories. However, the optimism was short-lived. The Young Turks, though hailed as liberators, were not a unified movement. Within the CUP, factions emerged. Some wanted rapid Turkification of the empire, centralizing power in Anatolia and promoting Turkish nationalism. Others advocated for a federal system respecting the autonomy of Arabs, Armenians, Greeks and other minorities. These ideological rifts soon led to power struggles, which were exploited by rival political groups. In 1909, a counter-coup erupted in Constantinople, led by conservative elements loyal to the old regime and religious factions opposed to the secularist direction of the Young Turks. The uprising briefly restored Abdul Hamid II's autocratic control, but the coup responded with force. Troops from Salonika marched on the capital, suppressed the revolt and deposed the Sultan. Abdul Hamid II was sent into exile, and his brother Mehmed ascended to the throne as a constitutional monarch. Though in reality power increasingly rested in the hands of the coup leadership. With their authority now consolidated, the Young Turks faced the immense challenge of reforming a crumbling empire. They began by reorganizing the army, introducing European-style training, and forging closer ties with Germany, which was eager to expand its influence in the Middle East. German military advisors, rail projects such as the Berlin-Baghdad Railway, and trade agreements marked a new phase of Ottoman-German cooperation. Meanwhile, the coup leadership tried to strengthen central authority in distant provinces, often clashing with local leaders and minority populations. One of the central policies of the Young Turks was the idea of Ottomanism, a hope that all subjects of the empire, regardless of ethnicity or religion, would see themselves as Ottomans first. But this vision struggled against rising tides of nationalism in the Balkans, the Arab provinces and Armenia. Minority groups saw the cup's policies not as inclusive but as increasingly Turkifying, sidelining their languages, traditions and political ambitions. This tension would erupt into violent conflicts and further weaken the empire's fragile social fabric. Economically, the situation remained dire. Foreign debts mounted, and European powers still exerted heavy influence over Ottoman finances through the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. Efforts to industrialize were slow, and rural unrest simmered as heavy taxation continued to burden peasants. In this environment, the coup leadership, now increasingly authoritarian itself, looked outward for opportunities to strengthen the empire's position on the world stage. By the early 1910s, the Ottoman Empire had become a theater for great power rivalry. Britain, France, Russia and Austria-Hungary all competed for influence in the Balkans, the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean. Germany, relatively new to this imperial game, offered the Young Turks both military expertise and promises of support against the empire's traditional enemies, Russia and Britain. The Balkan Wars of 1912 to 1913 dealt another devastating blow to Ottoman prestige. The empire lost nearly all its remaining European territories, including Macedonia, Kosovo, and most of Thrace. Refugees poured into Anatolia, and the army was left humiliated and exhausted. For the coup leadership, these defeats reinforced the belief that only through radical centralization and a strong alliance with a major European power could the empire survive. The stage was thus set for the next dramatic turn, the approach of a global war that would pull the Ottoman Empire into its final, fateful struggle. In the years leading up to World War I, the Young Turks increasingly leaned toward the German Empire, drawn by promises of military modernization, railway expansion and protection against Russia. The alliance would prove both a gamble and a trap. By 1914, the triumvirate at the heart of the coup, Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha and Cemal Pasha, had become the de facto rulers of the empire. Each held key positions, Enver as Minister of War, Talat as Minister of the Interior, and Cemal as Minister of the Navy. Together they sought to restore Ottoman power through bold, often ruthless decisions, believing that the coming war could provide the empire with a chance to reclaim lost lands and prestige. But as events unfolded, their choices would drag the empire into a conflict that would cost millions of lives and seal the fate of the Ottoman dynasty. This first phase of the story of the Young Turks captures both the promise and peril of their revolution, the hope of reform, the failure of unity, and the gradual slide into authoritarianism and external entanglements. It was a moment when the empire seemed poised between revival and ruin, and the decisions taken in these years would determine its role in the cataclysm of World War I. As the First World War loomed over Europe in the summer of 1914, the Ottoman Empire faced a choice that would decide its fate for generations to come: remain neutral and risk isolation, or side with one of the great alliances and gamble its future on war. For the triumvirate leading the Committee of Union and Progress, Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha and Cemal Pasha, this was not simply a matter of foreign policy but of survival. The Balkan Wars had left the Ottoman army depleted and humiliated, yet the desire to regain lost lands and restore imperial prestige burned strongly among the Young Turk leadership. Enver Pasha, the most ambitious of the three, believed that an alliance with Germany offered the best chance to rebuild the empire and strike at its old enemies: Russia in the east, Britain in the Mediterranean, and the French in North Africa. Talat Pasha focused on internal stability and feared that neutrality would leave the empire exposed to partition. Cemal Pasha, more cautious at first, eventually sided with the pro-German faction as the diplomatic landscape shifted rapidly. Initially, the Ottomans attempted to remain neutral. Both the Entente powers, Britain, France, and Russia, and the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, courted the empire for strategic reasons. The Ottoman Straits, controlling access to the Black Sea, were of vital importance, and the empire's vast Middle Eastern territories lay at the crossroads of global trade and imperial ambitions. However, the British seizure of 2 dreadnought warships that the Ottomans had ordered and paid for, just before the outbreak of war, soured relations with London and pushed public sentiment toward Germany. In August 1914, a secret treaty was signed between the Ottoman Empire and the German Empire, promising military alliance and mutual support. The Ottomans still hesitated to officially enter the war, but events quickly escalated. In October 1914, Ottoman warships, including the German battlecruiser Goeben, renamed Yavuz Sultan Selim, bombarded Russian ports in the Black Sea. Russia declared war in response, and soon the British and French followed. The empire was now at war, drawn into a global conflict it was ill-prepared to fight. The entry into World War I marked a turning point in Ottoman history. The empire became a battlefield on multiple fronts: the Caucasus against Russia, the Dardanelles and Gallipoli against the British and Anzac forces, Mesopotamia and Palestine against British campaigns, and the Arabian Peninsula where the seeds of the Arab Revolt were sown. Enver Pasha took personal command of the Caucasus front, launching a winter offensive at Sarıkamış in 1914–1915 that ended in disaster, with tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers freezing or starving to death. Meanwhile, the empire's diverse population became both an asset and a threat. The young Turk leadership feared internal uprisings and foreign-backed revolts, particularly among Christian minorities and Arab provinces. These fears, combined with nationalist policies and wartime paranoia, led to one of the darkest chapters in Ottoman history, the Armenian Genocide of 1915. Under the orders of the Cup, mass deportations, forced marches and massacres were carried out against the Armenian population, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of thousands. This atrocity would leave a lasting scar on the region and the world's memory of the Ottoman era. On other fronts, the war brought both fleeting triumphs and bitter defeats. The Gallipoli campaign of 1915–1916 became one of the empire's rare successes. Under the command of Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, Ottoman forces repelled a massive Allied landing aimed at capturing the Dardanelles and opening a sea route to Russia. The victory at Gallipoli boosted morale and gave the empire a temporary reprieve from the relentless pressure of the war. However, in Mesopotamia, the British eventually captured Baghdad in 1917, and in Palestine, General Edmund Allenby's campaign pushed Ottoman forces back toward Syria. The Arab Revolt, led by Sharif Hussein of Mecca and aided by British officers like T. Lawrence, undermined Ottoman authority in the Arabian Peninsula, cutting off vital communication and supply routes. Throughout the war, the Cup leadership tightened its grip on power, ruling with increasing authoritarianism. Censorship was reinstated, dissent was crushed, and political opponents were exiled or executed. The dream of a pluralistic Ottomanism was long abandoned, replaced by a desperate struggle to hold the empire together through force and centralization. Economic hardship grew severe. Famine struck parts of the empire, especially in Lebanon and Syria, while inflation and shortages plagued the cities. By 1918, the Central Powers were collapsing under the weight of the war. Germany, the empire's chief ally, was facing revolution and defeat. The Ottoman army, stretched thin and demoralized, could no longer hold its fronts. On October 30, 1918, the Armistice of Mudros was signed, ending the empire's participation in the war. Allied forces soon occupied Constantinople, and the once mighty empire lay prostrate, its fate to be decided by the victors of the war. The consequences of the Young Turks' decision to enter World War I were catastrophic. Millions of soldiers and civilians perished, vast territories were lost, and the empire's international reputation was in ruins. The promises of the revolution, constitutional governance, modernization and revival, had given way to war, devastation and dismemberment. Enver, Tulit and Cemal Pasha, the architects of this fateful course, fled into exile as the empire crumbled. Each would meet a violent end in the years that followed. Enver was killed in Central Asia fighting the Bolsheviks, Tulit was assassinated in Berlin by an Armenian revolutionary, and Cemal was gunned down in Tbilisi. Their legacy remained one of ambition intertwined with tragedy, a vision of imperial resurgence that instead hastened the empire's demise. Yet, out of the ruins of this war and the wreckage left by the Young Turk era, a new figure would rise, a young officer who had distinguished himself at Gallipoli and who would lead the Turkish War of Independence, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. The Ottoman Empire was dying, but its ashes would give birth to a republic. The Young Turks had set out to save an empire. Instead, they had steered it into the maelstrom of a global war that tore apart its foundations, scattered its peoples, and ended a dynasty that had ruled for over 6 centuries. Their story is one of revolutionary zeal turned into authoritarian control, of grand promises ending in catastrophe, and of how a gamble on war became the final act in the long drama of the Ottoman state. The Ottoman Empire entered the final phase of its existence in the aftermath of the First World War. Defeat in 1918 left the once great empire prostrate, its government in turmoil, its people exhausted, and its territories vulnerable to occupation. The armistice signed at Mudros on October 30, 1918 marked the end of Ottoman participation in the war and effectively ended its authority as an independent power. Allied warships entered the Bosphorus soon after, their silhouettes casting long shadows over the domes and minarets of Istanbul. For centuries the Ottoman sultans had ruled an empire that stretched across 3 continents. Now their authority extended barely beyond the walls of the capital. The terms of the armistice allowed the Allies, Britain, France, Italy and later Greece, to occupy key Ottoman territories under the pretext of maintaining order and securing their war aims. British forces moved into Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf, French troops occupied Cilicia and parts of Syria, while Italian units landed on the southern coast of Anatolia. The Greeks, emboldened by Allied promises and their own expansionist vision known as the Megali idea, landed at Smyrna, modern Izmir, in May 1919, sparking deep resentment among the Turkish population. The empire, once the dominant force of the eastern Mediterranean, was being carved apart. Within Istanbul, the political climate was one of confusion and humiliation. Sultan Mehmed VI, the last Ottoman sultan to exercise full imperial power, hoped to preserve what remained of the empire by cooperating with the Allies. He dissolved the parliament in 1920 and relied on a circle of loyal officials to negotiate with foreign powers. The government signed the Treaty of Sèvres in August 1920, a document that envisaged the partition of the Ottoman heartlands. Under its terms, much of Anatolia would fall under Greek, French and Italian influence, Armenia would gain independence in the east, and an autonomous Kurdish region was proposed. The Straits would be internationalized, and the Sultan would retain only nominal authority over Istanbul and its surroundings. For many Turks, this treaty represented the ultimate betrayal of their sovereignty. Resistance began to stir, first in scattered local uprisings and then under the leadership of a determined group of officers, intellectuals and patriots. Among them, one man emerged as the central figure. Mustafa Kemal, a former Ottoman general who had distinguished himself during the Gallipoli campaign of 1915. Disillusioned with the Sultan's government and convinced that the empire could not survive under Allied control, he traveled to Samsun on the Black Sea coast in May 1919 to begin organizing a national resistance movement. The conditions in Anatolia were desperate. Refugees from the Balkans and the Caucasus crowded into towns and villages, food shortages were widespread, and banditry was on the rise. Yet the national movement found fertile ground among peasants, students and former soldiers who refused to accept the dismemberment of their homeland. Mustafa Kemal convened congresses at Erzurum and Sivas in the summer of 1919, rallying support for a program that rejected the Treaty of Sèvres and called for the defense of Turkish-majority lands. By early 1920, the nationalist forces had established a provisional parliament in Ankara, far from the reach of the Allied forces in Istanbul. This Grand National Assembly declared itself the legitimate government of the Turkish people, setting the stage for a confrontation with the Sultan's regime. Civil war and foreign occupation intertwined. The Sultan's loyalists clashed with nationalists, while Greek, French and Armenian forces advanced into Anatolia. The Greek occupation of Smyrna became a flashpoint. Greek troops, supported by the Allies, pushed inland toward the Anatolian heartland in 1920 to 1921, committing atrocities that inflamed Turkish resistance. The nationalist army reorganized under Mustafa Kemal's command and with the help of officers such as İsmet İnönü and Fevzi Çakmak, launched a series of defensive campaigns. The battles of İnönü in early 1921 marked the first significant victories of the Turkish nationalist movement, boosting morale and proving that organized resistance could succeed. Meanwhile, the international situation was shifting. The Soviet Union, having emerged from its own revolution and civil war, saw the Turkish nationalists as a potential ally against Western imperialism. Moscow provided weapons, gold, and diplomatic recognition to the Ankara government, strengthening its position. France and Italy, weary of prolonged conflict in Anatolia and facing their own post-war challenges, began to negotiate with Mustafa Kemal's representatives, gradually withdrawing their troops from southern Anatolia. The Sultan's authority crumbled as the nationalist movement gained momentum. In November 1922, the Grand National Assembly formally abolished the Sultanate, deposing Mehmed VI, who fled into exile aboard a British warship. This act ended over 6 centuries of Ottoman dynastic rule. Istanbul remained under Allied occupation, but the political heart of the Turkish nation had shifted irrevocably to Ankara. The collapse of the empire was not merely a political event, it was a profound social and cultural rupture. Millions of people who had identified as Ottoman subjects now faced uncertain futures. Non-Muslim minorities, including Armenians and Greeks, had already suffered immense losses during the war through deportations, massacres, and forced population movements. The empire's Arab provinces had been detached, forming new states under British and French mandates. In the Balkans, almost no Ottoman territory remained. As 1922 drew to a close, the Turkish War of Independence entered its decisive phase. The nationalist army, now better organized and supplied, launched a counteroffensive against the Greek forces in western Anatolia. The decisive Battle of Dumlupınar in August 1922 broke the Greek army's hold on the region, leading to their chaotic retreat toward the Aegean coast. Smyrna was recaptured in September 1922, but the victory was accompanied by tragedy. A massive fire swept through the city, destroying much of its cosmopolitan quarters and displacing tens of thousands of civilians. By the end of that year, the political map of Anatolia had been transformed. The Sultan was gone, the nationalist government was in control, and the stage was set for the negotiation of a new international settlement that would replace the hated Treaty of Sèvres. This would come in the form of the Treaty of Lausanne, negotiated in 1923, which recognized the sovereignty of the new Turkish Republic and marked the final dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. The first part of this final chapter traces the descent from imperial defeat to national awakening, the humiliation of occupation, the rise of Mustafa Kemal, the armed struggle for survival, and the abolition of the Sultanate. It was a period of chaos and suffering, but also of profound transformation, as the old imperial order gave way to a new conception of nationhood. The abolition of the Sultanate in November 1922 marked a decisive turning point. For the first time in over 6 centuries, the Ottoman throne was empty, and the political authority of the dynasty was broken. Sultan Mehmed VI departed into exile aboard the British warship Malaya, leaving behind a city occupied by foreign troops and a people uncertain of their future. Istanbul, once the beating heart of the empire, became a symbol of lost grandeur and a city under foreign shadow, while the real momentum shifted to Ankara, the new center of resistance and political organization. With the old regime removed, the focus turned to international diplomacy. The Allies, forced to recognize the collapse of their puppet arrangement in Istanbul, invited the Ankara government to negotiations that would redefine the future of Anatolia and eastern Thrace. These talks culminated in the Lausanne Conference, held in Switzerland from late 1922 to mid-1923. The Turkish delegation, led by İsmet İnönü, entered the negotiations with a strong mandate to reverse the humiliations of the Treaty of Sèvres and secure international recognition of a sovereign Turkish state. The negotiations were tense and protracted. The Allies, particularly Britain under Prime Minister David Lloyd George, sought to protect their interests in the Middle East and secure favorable terms for their Greek ally, but the reality on the ground had changed. The Greek army was in retreat, France and Italy were no longer willing to press their claims in Anatolia, and the Soviet Union quietly supported the Turkish stance to weaken Western influence in the region. After months of deliberation, the Treaty of Lausanne was signed on July 24, 1923. This treaty marked a profound reversal of fortunes. It annulled the Treaty of Sèvres, restored full sovereignty over Anatolia and eastern Thrace to the Turkish state, and recognized the authority of the Ankara government as the legitimate representative of the Turkish people. The Straits were placed under an international regime but remained under Turkish control, and the new borders largely resembled those of modern Turkey, except for the loss of Mosul, retained by Britain through its mandate in Iraq, and the acceptance of new boundaries with Syria and the Caucasus. One of the most significant and controversial provisions of the post-war settlement was the compulsory population exchange between Greece and Turkey. Agreed upon in 1923, this exchange uprooted approximately 1.5 million Anatolian Greeks and 500,000 Muslims from Greece. Entire communities were displaced, centuries-old villages were emptied, and cultural landscapes were irrevocably altered. While the exchange aimed to create more ethnically homogeneous nation-states, it caused immense human suffering and marked the end of the multicultural Ottoman world in the Aegean and Anatolia. The Treaty of Lausanne paved the way for the formal proclamation of the Republic of Turkey. On October 29, 1923, the Grand National Assembly declared the establishment of the Republic, with Ankara as its capital. Mustafa Kemal was elected its first president, and the new government embarked on an ambitious program to modernize and secularize the country. For many Turks, this was the dawn of a new era. The Ottoman past, with its sultans, caliphs, and imperial administration, was replaced by a vision of a national, unitary, and modern state. The early years of the Republic were marked by sweeping reforms that would reshape Turkish society. The Caliphate, a symbol of pan-Islamic authority, was abolished in March 1924, removing the last vestige of Ottoman religious political legitimacy. The legal system was overhauled, replacing Islamic courts with secular codes inspired by European models. Education was secularized and centralized, Arabic script was replaced with a modified Latin alphabet, and Western dress codes were encouraged over the traditional fez and robes. Women were gradually granted new rights, including access to education and, later, suffrage. These reforms, driven by Mustafa Kemal's vision of a modern, secular nation-state, were not without opposition. Traditionalists, former Ottoman elites, and segments of the rural population resisted the rapid pace of change. Rebellions flared in various regions, most notably the Sheikh Said Rebellion in 1925, which combined religious and regional grievances against the new order. However, the government responded firmly, consolidating its authority through both political and military means. The fall of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of modern Turkey represented one of the most dramatic transformations in the 20th century. A multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire had given way to a nation-state defined by Turkish identity and secular nationalism. Millions of people who once lived under the Ottoman banner now found themselves in new countries or as minorities in lands they had inhabited for generations. The Arab provinces formed separate states under European mandates. The Balkans were almost entirely lost, and only the Anatolian heartland remained. For the wider world, the birth of the Turkish Republic symbolized both the end of an old imperial order and the resilience of a nation determined to survive foreign domination. Unlike many other defeated powers of the First World War, Turkey managed to negotiate from a position of strength, turning military defeat into diplomatic victory. Its experience would inspire anti-colonial movements across Asia and Africa, showing that determined resistance and strategic negotiation could overturn even the harshest treaties. Culturally, the transformation was equally profound. Istanbul remained a cosmopolitan city but was no longer the imperial capital. Ankara, once a modest Anatolian town, became the heart of a modernizing state. The new republic faced the immense task of building a national identity that could unite Anatolia's diverse populations while distancing itself from the legacy of the Ottoman dynasty. This tension between continuity and rupture would shape Turkish politics for decades to come. The events of 1922 to 1923 were thus both an ending and a beginning, the final dissolution of an empire that had shaped the Middle East, the Balkans, and North Africa for centuries, and the birth of a republic that sought to chart its own course in a world still dominated by European powers. Mustafa Kemal, soon to be honored with the surname Ataturk, father of the Turks, emerged as the architect of this new order, combining military leadership with political vision. By the time the last Allied troops withdrew from Istanbul in 1923, the Ottoman Empire was a memory. Its palaces still stood, its mosques still rose over the skyline, but the empire that had once linked 3 continents had vanished. In its place stood a new state, one that promised reform, progress, and independence but also demanded loyalty to a singular national identity. The echoes of this transformation continue to shape Turkey's history and its relationship with the legacy of the Ottomans even today.